An invitation into the dark. Somewhere out in the dark, a man is calling the hour. You cannot see him yet. You only hear him, a flat, unhurried voice, 2 streets away, saying the time allowed to nobody in particular, the way he has said it every hour of every night for years. And then the small sounds that go with him, a staff tapping stone, a door being tried and found fast, boots going on again down the wet street. He is not hurrying. There is nothing to hurry towards. He will say it again in an hour, a little further off, and again after that a little nearer, and between his voice and the next there is only the rain. Let that be the first thing tonight, a voice counting the hours in the dark and rain. You are lying somewhere above a London street, in a room you're not going to see clearly, on a bed of straw or flock, under a coarse wool blanket, and the room smells of the coal fire that has gone down to a red ring in the grate and of the wet wool of a coat hung on the door. There is no glass to speak of between you and the weather, a shutter and the wind finding its way past it, and the rain coming down steadily on the tiles above your head. The city outside is not silent, and it is not dark. Under the shutter, along the edge of it, there is a thin, unwavering line of yellow light, and that light is not the moon. It is a lamp, an oil lamp, on a post burning in the street below, one of 4,000 or 5,000 of them that stand across this city and burn all night and all year, and are checked and trimmed and lit again by men whose whole employment is to keep them going. This is one of the best lit cities in Europe. Remember that. Almost everything you have ever been told about this place invites you to imagine a black warren, and it was not one. It was a city of wet stone and standing lamplight, and the light lay on the puddles and made long soft shapes down the road. Breathe out, let your shoulders go down into the straw. Before we travel any further, if you are finding this peaceful, if this is helping you settle and rest, it would mean a great deal to me if you subscribed to the channel and left a like. It takes only a moment, and it helps this channel continue making these videos, and please write something in the comments. Tell me where you are in the world right now and what time it is where you are. I am always genuinely curious. Write it in the comments when you have a moment. Now let us continue. We are going to spend a long, slow night in the 18th century, and it will help you to know, before we set out, roughly where we are standing and what we are looking at. The place is London. The years run from about 1690 to about 1757. 3 human generations, near enough 70 years, though the part that matters most sits in the middle of it. The 30-odd years from the 1720s to the 1750s. Historians have given those years a name. They call them the Gin Craze. Nobody living through them called them that. The label was put on afterwards, the way labels usually are. The people in the story spoke instead of Madame Geneva, and of Mother Gin, and of the spirits trade, and of the distillers, and of the act, always the act. Whichever act was newest, and they argued about it in taverns and in pamphlets and in the street for a whole generation without once feeling the need to name the age they were living in. And what happened in those years is usually told to you as a horror story. That is not how we are going to tell it, and not only because you are trying to sleep. It is because the horror version is not, in the end, the true one, and the true one is better. Here is the shape of it, laid out plainly, so that you can let it go and simply follow. Parliament made gin cheap, not by accident, not by neglect, on purpose, in writing, for reasons that seemed excellent at the time, and had to do with grain, and with landowners, and with hurting the French. Then the city drank it, genuinely drank it, hard for 30 years in quantities we can still measure, Then Parliament, alarmed at what it had made, spent 22 years trying to take it back. 8 Acts of Parliament between 1729 and 1751, one after another, each one drafted by serious men who had studied the failure of the last one, and each one failing in its turn for a reason we can name. And then, when the statute book had exhausted itself, the thing ended anyway, quietly, and for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the law. The harvest failed, grain got dear, beer got cheap, and the city, without anybody deciding anything, simply stopped. That is the whole story. 8 laws, 22 years, and in the end it was the weather and the price of barley. I should say one careful thing about that number, because we are going to lean on it. 8 is the count that historians of the subject use, and it is the right count at that level, but 2 of the 8, the ones of 1737 and 1738, were not grand standalone statutes with their own names. They were amending clauses tucked inside other bills. The 1737 one rode into law inside an act about sweets and made wines. So when I say 8 acts in 22 years, that is what I mean, 8 interventions. Some enormous, some slipped in through a side door, all of them aimed at the same thing, and all of them in their own way beaten. We will go slowly. We will begin before any of it, in a London that has barely tasted spirits at all, and we will walk forward year by year, through the tax schedule that started everything, through what gin actually was, and why it hit so much harder than ale, through a city where by one official count more than 6,000 doors sold it, through the arithmetic of a labourer's day, the names people gave the drink, the women who sold it, the mock funeral held for Madame Geneva on a September night when the government fled the city and nothing at all happened, through the informers and the crowds that hunted them, through a cat's head nailed to a wall with a lead pipe under its paw, and out the other side into calm. There is nothing you need to hold on to. If you lose the thread will still be here. Let the voice go on, and the rain go on, and the lamp under the shutter go on burning, and the man out in the street counting the hours towards morning. London before the spirit. Go back, first to before. It is around the year 1700. The lamps are not yet as many as they will be. The city is smaller, though not small, something over 500,000 people, already the largest city in Western Europe, and growing every year by the steady arrival of country people who come down the roads into it and mostly do not go home again. And in this city at this date, the drink that fills the day is not gin, it is beer. Not beer as you might think of beer. There were 2 kinds in an ordinary household, and the everyday one was small beer. Weak, thin, brewed from the 2nd or 3rd running of the mash, barely alcoholic at all by our standards, sour-ish, cheap, and drunk by everyone, including children, at breakfast, at dinner, at work. It was food as much as drink. It carried some nourishment in it. It travelled, and it was the ordinary liquid of the ordinary day. Alongside it stood strong beer and ale, which were what you drank in the evening, in company, in an alehouse with a fire, and settles and other people's conversation, and which would make you drunk if you kept at it long enough, but slowly. That is the point to hold on to. Ale worked slowly. A man drinking ale had time to become talkative, then loud, then sleepy, and the whole society around him had centuries of practice in managing each of those stages. There was cider in the western counties, and wine for those who could afford it, and imported French brandy for those who could afford rather more, a gentleman's drink, a merchant's drink, expensive foreign, and about to become politically impossible. And there was water. And here I want to be careful with you, because there is a story about water that gets told about every pre-modern city, and it is not true of this one. You will hear it said that Londoners drank beer and later gin because the water would have killed them. It is one of those explanations that feels so satisfying that people stop checking it. When historians of medicine went looking for the evidence, for the complaints, the warnings, the physicians telling people to avoid the water, they found almost nothing. Complaints about the quality of London's water were, in the words of one specialist, few, if any, before the 19th century. Illness simply was not associated with drinking water at the time. When a doctor called Charles Lucas actually went and tested the supply in the 1750s, he came away with no medical objection to it at all. What the water was inconvenient. That is a very different thing. If you were reasonably comfortable, water came to your house through pipes. But the pipes were bored out elm trunks, laid under the streets, joined and leaking, with no pressure worth the name, and the supply came on only 2 or 3 times a week from a common cock. You filled what you had when it ran. You kept it in an open bucket in the house, and the bucket, in a great many houses, stood not far from the privy, because that was where there was room. And if you were poor, you very likely had no pipe at all, and you drew from a shallow well in the yard or the court, which took its water from ground that also held cesspits and burial grounds. So water that arrived twice a week, sat uncovered in a bucket, and tasted of the elm trunk it came through. Nobody was frightened of it. Nobody wrote pamphlets about it. It was simply less pleasant and less convenient than beer, and beer was everywhere and cheap, and so people drank beer. That is all the mystery there is, and it is worth setting straight now, because when gin arrives, the reason people take to it is going to be equally unmysterious and equally unromantic. It will be cheap and it will be strong. That is the whole of it. Now, how much spirit was this city drinking in 1700? Almost none. The best modern reconstruction puts English consumption of distilled spirits at around 1/3 of a gallon a head per year. 1/3 of a gallon. Spread across a year, that is a swallow now and then, a dram taken as a medicine, a warmer against the cold, something a sailor knew and a labourer largely did not. Distilling existed. There were distillers in London, organised in their own company, and there had been for generations. But spirits were a small trade at the edge of a great beer-drinking culture, and no one thought of them as a national question because they were not one. Hold that number in your mind gently, because we are going to come back to it 4 or 5 times tonight, and each time it will have moved. 1/3 of a gallon in 1700. That is where we stop. And picture the evening that goes with it. The alehouse with its low fire and its wooden settles and its jugs. The long, slow business of an evening's drinking among people who know each other. The landlord who knows exactly who has had enough and will say so. Drink in this city at this date is social, communal, slow, and takes place in a room built for the purpose, with a fire in it and somewhere to sit. Stay in that room a little longer, because it is worth knowing what is about to be lost. An alehouse in 1700 is a public room in a private house as often as it is a business. There is a fire, and settles along the wall, and a long table, and pewter and earthenware, and rushes or sand on the floor. There is somebody's wife carrying jugs. There are men who have come in off the same work, and will go out to the same work tomorrow, and they know each other's names and each other's debts. Drink is served into vessels that are passed and shared. The evening has a shape. It begins, it warms, it becomes noisy, it becomes maudlin, and at some point the landlord says a word to somebody, and the somebody goes home more or less on his own feet, because everyone in the room has been watching him arrive at that state for the last 3 hours. That watching is the thing. It is not a rule anywhere, but it is an entire technology of social control, invented slowly over centuries, and it depends absolutely on the fact that fermented drink works slowly enough to be watched. And there is a second thing in that room which will not survive the change either, and it is the reckoning. Drink was sold on credit, on a slate, in a house where the seller knew you and knew where you lived and knew what you earned. That is a relationship with all its cruelties and all its mercies. The transaction that replaces it, a penny across a counter to a stranger, or into a drawer in a wall to somebody you cannot even see, has no relationship in it at all. None of that is nostalgia. Plenty of men drank themselves stupid in alehouses and went home and were terrible. But the machinery for noticing existed, and it was about to meet something it could not handle. Every part of that is about to change, and it will change because of a tax schedule. The Parliament that made gin cheap. The whole of this story begins in an Act of Parliament, and the Act is not about drinking. It is about corn. In 1689, England went to war with France, and among the first casualties was the brandy trade. Parliament banned the import of French wines, brandies, and other goods outright, an economic weapon aimed at the enemy's revenues, and one that abruptly emptied a large and profitable shelf in the English market. Gentlemen who drank brandy now could not get brandy, at least not legally, and the merchants who had made money bringing it in were looking about for something else to sell. Then, 1 year later, in 1690, Parliament passed the Act that made the rest of this evening possible. It is titled, with perfect 18th century flatness, an Act for the encouraging the distilling of brandy and spirits from corn. Read that title again, slowly encouraging. Parliament is not permitting distilling here or regulating it. Parliament is encouraging it and says so on the face of the statute. What the Act did was simple and enormous. It voided every existing charter for the sole making of brandy spirits or strong waters from corn. The monopoly that the Distillers' Company had held over the trade was simply dissolved, without even being named, and in its place it permitted any person or persons to distill spirits from English grain. Any person. There was no licensing requirement of any kind. If you had a vessel, a fire, and some grain, you were legally a distiller. That alone would have been remarkable, but it is the duty schedule attached to it that tells you what Parliament actually wanted, and I want to give it to you in full, because the whole shape of the next 60 years is folded up inside 4 numbers. Spirits distilled from malted corn, 1 penny a gallon. Spirits distilled from other English materials, 12 pence a gallon. Spirits from imported materials, 8 pence. Spirits from cider or perry, 3 pence, 1 penny against 12. Distilling from English grain was taxed at 1/12 the rate of distilling from anything else grown in England. That is not an excise schedule with a preference in it. That is an agricultural subsidy wearing an excise schedule as a coat. And the sequence matters as much as the content. French brandy is cut off in 1689. English grain distilling is thrown wide open in 1690. Parliament made a spirits-shaped hole in the market, and then, 12 months later, told every Englishman with a pot and a fire that he was free to fill it, and that it would cost him a penny a gallon to do so. Why? 2 reasons, both of them entirely rational from where the men in the chamber were sitting. The first was to damage France. Every gallon of English grain spirit was a gallon of French brandy not bought, and money not sent across the Channel to a hostile power. In the 17th and 18th centuries, this argument had enormous force. You will meet it again in 50 years' time in a poem printed under a Hogarth engraving, still cheerfully telling the English to leave water to the French. The second reason is the one that runs underneath everything else tonight: grain. England's landowners produced corn, and there were years, many years in this period, when they produced a great deal more of it than the country could eat. A glut of grain means a low price, and a low price means unhappy landowners. And unhappy landowners sat in both houses of Parliament and were the government's own political base. Distilling solved that beautifully. A distillery would take grain that was too poor for bread and too poor for brewing, damaged corn, meanly grown corn, the bottom of the harvest, and turn it into something saleable. It put a floor under the price of the worst grain in England. So gin was, from the very beginning, a landed interest subsidy programme, not a moral failure, not a foreign vice creeping in. A deliberate policy designed to prop up English agriculture and injure French commerce. And it worked exactly as designed for about 30 years before anyone noticed what else it was doing. There is one more thread from that act worth pulling, because it will matter later. The 1690 statute also required that spirits be drawn without any mixture, pure, on penalty of £5 a barrel. There was, in other words, a purity clause in English law from the very first day of the trade. Every adulteration that would later horrify the reformers was already illegal in 1690. The law simply had no means whatever of finding out or of doing anything about it if it did. And meanwhile, quietly, Parliament was doing the opposite thing to beer. From 1688 onward, the duties on ale and beer rose and went on rising, because beer was a reliable, countable, taxable trade run by large brewers with fixed addresses, and governments at war need revenue. The duties on spirits stayed where they were. By the height of the craze, the gap had become almost comic. Spirits carried something in the order of twopence a gallon in duty, while strong beer carried 4 shillings and 9p. Sit with that a moment, because it is the sentence the whole video turns on, and we will come back to it right at the end. Gin was not cheap because distillers were generous, or because the poor were foolish, or because vice is contagious. Gin was cheap because Parliament had made beer expensive and grain spirit almost free, and had done both deliberately, for good reasons that had nothing to do with what anybody would drink. The city would spend the next 70 years finding out what that meant, and Parliament would spend 22 of those years trying to undo it, against the resistance of the very landowners it had built the policy to please. Outside, the rain has thinned. The lamp under your shutter goes on burning, steady and yellow. The watchman has moved further off. You can only just hear him now. What Madame Geneva actually was. Let us take the bottle down off the shelf and look at it properly, because a great deal of what follows depends on what was actually in it. Start with the name, which is a small joke that has lasted 300 years. Geneva has nothing to do with Switzerland. The word comes from the Dutch Geneva, and Geneva comes from the Latin juniperus, juniper. The drink is named after the berry that flavours it, and the resemblance to the name of a Swiss city is pure coincidence, which did not stop English drinkers enjoying it. Bernard Mandeville, writing in 1714, set the whole thing down in a single sentence. The name, he said, was derived from juniper in Dutch, and had since shrunk into a monosyllable, intoxicating gin. Shrunk into a monosyllable. That is exactly what happened to it, and it happened fast. A long foreign word for a curious imported cordial became a short, blunt English one for something you bought at a counter for a penny. Now, how was it made? The trade had 2 stages, legally and practically separated, and it is worth getting them the right way round, because almost everyone gets them backwards. At the first stage stood the malt distillers. These were large operations, mostly in and around London, and their business was industrial. They bought grain by the wagon load, fermented it, and distilled it into what the trade called low wines, a raw, coarse, high-strength spirit, not fit to drink and not meant to be drunk. Low wines were a commodity, sold by the cask, and the men who made them were substantial businessmen with capital premises, and this matters enormously later, friends in Parliament. At the second stage stood the compound distillers, also called rectifiers. They bought the low wines and made them into something a person would actually swallow, redistilling, diluting, sweetening, and flavouring juniper, if they had it and could afford it, and a good many other things besides. Sugar was common, so were spices. The 18th century product was heavy and sweetened, nothing at all like the dry gin of a modern bar, which is a 19th century invention. If anything, imagine something closer to an old-fashioned sweet cordial with a hard spirit underneath it. Hold those two ends apart in your mind, big malt distillers at the top, thousands of small compounders and retailers at the bottom, because every single one of the 8 acts we are going to meet tonight lands on the small end. The gin acts went after retailers and compounders. They very rarely went after the malt distillers, who were large, respectable, well-connected, and supplying the market that kept the landed interest solvent. That was not an oversight. That was the design. And what went into the compounding? Here, I want to be exact, because there is a lurid version of this story, and it is wrong in an interesting way. The lurid version says that criminal gin makers secretly poisoned their product with turpentine and sulfuric acid. What is true is that oil of turpentine and oil of vitriol both appear in the gin recipes of the period. What is false is the word secretly. These things were not whispered underworld practice. They were printed. They are in the distillers' manuals, in books like Ambrose Cooper's Complete Distiller, set out as ordinary trade technique for anyone who could read. Oil of turpentine was a cheap substitute for juniper, and it is not a mad substitute either. Turpentine and juniper share a good deal of the same aromatic chemistry, which is precisely why one could stand in for the other. Oil of vitriol had a role in rectifying. This was documented professional practice in a trade with no meaningful inspection, not a conspiracy. And there is a quiet irony in it that is worth a sentence. The people prosecuted again and again over the coming decades were the small street sellers, very often women with a basket or a stall. The people actually compounding spirit out of turpentine in a back room were, on the whole, men in the trade, and they were largely left alone. Now the fact that matters more than any other in this chapter, and possibly in the whole video. Gin was strong. Not a little stronger than beer, orders of magnitude stronger. Small beer was barely alcoholic. Strong ale would make you drunk if you worked at it for an evening. Gin did it in minutes. One contemporary account from 1736 describes people who, having drunk, were in an instant rendered so much intoxicated as to lose the use of their reason. In an instant. That is the whole physical difference, and every social consequence in this story descends from it. I'm not going to give you a percentage, because nobody honestly can. You will see confident numbers quoted for the strength of 1740s street gin, and every one of them is invented. There was no standard, no gauge on a backroom still, no label, no inspection worth the name. That was rather the point. What you bought at a counter in Shoreditch might be modestly strong or brutally strong, and the person selling it very often did not know either. Dutch Geneva of the period was around half spirit. Cheap London gin was whatever came out of that particular pot on that particular day. Think for a moment about what that does to a culture that has spent 500 years learning to drink slowly. Every custom England had around drink assumed time. The alehouse assumed time. You sat, you talked. The landlord watched you, and if you were going to be a nuisance, he could see it coming an hour off. The whole grammar of drunkenness, the merry stage, the maudlin stage, the sleepy stage, assumed a body absorbing alcohol at the rate that fermented drink delivers it. Distilled spirits at street price broke that grammar completely. A person could go from sober to insensible standing at a counter, in the open, in the middle of the afternoon, without any of the stages in between, and without anybody having a chance to intervene. That is why it looked to people watching like something new in the world, and it genuinely was. When Henry Fielding wrote many years later of a new kind of drunkenness unknown to our ancestors, he was not merely being alarmist. He was describing a real change, and describing it fairly accurately. What he could not know was why it had happened, and the reason was not moral. The reason was 1 penny a gallon against 12. Cheap corn, cheap spirit. The 1720s are when the curve begins to climb, and it is worth watching it climb slowly, because that is how the people living inside it experienced it. Nobody woke up one morning in a different city. It came on the way weather comes on. Take the numbers first gently, and then we will put them away. In 1700, English consumption of spirits ran at about 1/3 of a gallon a head per year. By 1720, it was about 2/3. It had doubled, but doubling a very small number still leaves a small number, and nobody was much alarmed. By 1729, it was 1 3/10 gallons a head. That is 4 times the 1700 figure in 30 years, and that is when the first Act arrives, which tells you that Parliament was watching the same curve we are. It kept climbing for another 14 years after that. We will get there. What drove it was not fashion, it was the harvest. The 1720s and 30s in England were, on the whole, decades of good and abundant grain. Abundant grain means cheap grain, and cheap grain in a country whose statute book taxed grain spirit at 1 penny a gallon means cheap spirit in enormous quantity made from corn that had no better use. And here is the part that locks the whole thing in place. Distilling gave farmers a market for grain of the meanest quality, grain too poor for the baker, too poor for the brewer, grain that in another year would have been fed to pigs or left to rot. That is why the trade was in practice impossible to suppress. It was not merely that people liked gin, it was that behind every gin shop in Holborn stood a compounder, and behind the compounder a malt distiller, and behind the malt distiller a landowner in Hertfordshire or Essex or Kent, who was getting a price for the bottom of his harvest that he had never got before, and who had a seat in Parliament, or knew 4 men who did. Every attempt to close the shop at the street end of that chain was felt immediately and personally at the country end of it. We will watch that happen in 1733, and it is one of the cleanest political stories in this whole period. Look at the absolute quantities, and the scale becomes physical. In 1730, English distillers produced about 3.8 million gallons of spirit. By 1735, 6.4 million. That is production nearly doubling in 5 years, not a trend, an eruption. Somebody has to make that, and store it, and cart it, and sell it, and drink it. By the 1730s, contemporaries reckoned there were over 1,500 distillers in London. That is a reckoning rather than a register. Nobody was counting properly, because after 1690 nobody had to be licensed, but it is the right order of magnitude, and it describes something specific, a trade of small operator. 1,500 distillers is not 1,500 factories. It is a few dozen substantial malt houses and something over 1,000 backroom compounders working in cellars and outhouses and yards, buying low wines by the cask and turning them into whatever they could sell. And you would have smelled it. That is the thing that never comes through in the statistics. Distilling has a smell, hot grain mash, sour and bready and thick, and under it the sharp clean note of spirit vapour, and in a district where 40 or 50 small compounders were working, that smell hung in the streets. It joined a city that already smelled powerfully of coal smoke, because London burned sea coal shipped down the coast from Newcastle, and burned an immense amount of it. Modern estimates, and they are estimates, modelled rather than measured, suggest the sulphur in London's air roughly doubled between the 1670s and the 1720s. The craze happened in a city whose air was at about its early modern worst. So, a coal haze in the winter light, the mash smell in the eastern parishes, grain barges coming up on the tide, carts of casks in the lanes, cheap corn going in one end of the city and cheap spirit coming out of the other. There is a useful check to run on all these figures, by the way, and it comes out well, which is not something one can say about most numbers in this subject. Take the peak per capita figure, 2.2 gallons a head, and multiply it by a rough estimate of the adult population of England at the time. You arrive at something close to 8 million gallons. And 8 million gallons is near enough the absolute production figure the excise records give for the same years. Two entirely different kinds of measurement, made for different purposes, arriving at the same place. When we come much later tonight to numbers that do not survive that kind of check, and there will be several, it is worth remembering that these ones do. There is one more thing to notice about the 1720s, and it is a thing that did not happen. Nobody stopped it. There was no moment at which the government looked at the curve and said, "This policy has escaped us. Close it down." The excise was collecting. The landowners were content. The distillers were prospering. The Treasury was in the middle of a long, expensive century of wars and had no appetite for cutting a revenue stream. The first serious complaint came not from Westminster, but from magistrates and physicians, men who saw the streets and the bodies rather than the ledgers, and it took years for that complaint to reach the statute book at all. Which is worth remembering the next time we are tempted to be superior about the 18th century. The policy was working in the precise terms in which it had been designed. It supported grain prices, it hurt French exports, it filled the excise. That it was also doing something else was, for a good long while, simply not the kind of information the machinery was built to collect. The city that sold it everywhere. Now come down into the street, because this is the chapter where you can see it. In January 1726, a committee of Middlesex justices did something the 18th century very rarely did. They went out across Middlesex and Westminster and totted up the houses and shops, where in Geneva or other strong waters were publicly sold by retail, and they arrived at a figure 6,187. That is not a pamphleteer's number. That is magistrates walking about with a list, and they broke it down by parish, and the breakdown is the part that stays with you. In some parishes, they reported, every 10th house, in others every 7th, and in one of the largest, 1 house in 5. 1 house in 5 stand in a street of 20 houses, and 4 of them are selling spirits over a counter. You will see other figures thrown about. 7,000 dram shops, 1 house in 4, and they are not worth having. Take the magistrates' count because they went and looked. But 6,000 doors is only a number until you understand what kind of doors they were. And this is where the picture in your head probably needs correcting. The single strongest piece of evidence for how far gin had spread is not a count at all. It is a clause in an Act of Parliament. When the Great Prohibitive Act came in 1736, it specifically forbade distillers, grocers, chandlers, jails and workhouses from selling gin. Read that list again: jails, workhouses. Parliament does not trouble to ban prisons and workhouses from retailing spirits unless prisons and workhouses are retailing spirit. That one line tells you more than any pamphlet. The trade had got everywhere, including inside the institutions the state had built to manage the poor. And beyond that, everywhere else. Gin was sold out of weavers' shops and dyers' shops, out of barbers' shops and carpenters' and shoemakers. It was sold from private houses, from stalls, from baskets, from wheelbarrows pushed through the streets, and from boats on the river. It was hawked to the crowds at public executions. You can see the seller at work in the background of one of Hogarth's own prints from 1747, moving among the people gathered at Tyburn. The most important channel of all, though, was the dullest. The chandler's shop, the corner grocer, the place you went for candles and cheese and coal by the ha'porth and small quantities of everything, sold gin as one line of stock among many. That single fact reshapes the whole picture. It meant a servant girl, or a wife, or a widow could buy spirits in the ordinary course of the day's errands, at the ordinary shop, with no more comment than buying soap. There was no threshold to cross. There was no door with a reputation. There was the same counter you were at anyway. And the gin shop proper, where one existed, was not an alehouse, and had no wish to be. It was usually one room with a counter across it. No settles, no fire to sit at, no long table, no landlord presiding over an evening. You stood, you drank, or you took it away with you. That is a quietly devastating detail when you think about what it means. Gin had no conviviality built into it. Ale came with a room and a company and a set of manners. Gin came with a counter and a coin, and everything that happened afterwards happened somewhere else, in a doorway, in a court, at home. Everywhere in the poorer parishes, but the names that recur are St Giles in the Fields, Holborn, Shoreditch, Bethnal Green, the courts around Moorfields, and a good deal of Westminster. St Giles has the worst reputation of the lot, and the reputation is genuine. The parish had, by measurement, the highest rate of petty offences in London. But I want to correct the picture that name conjures, because it is a 20-year anachronism inside our own story. The St Giles you are imagining, the famous maze of alleys 2 feet wide, black and tunnelled and impassable, was not there yet. That Warren was built after about 1760 as infill when a brewery lease ran out. In the 1740s, the accommodation in St Giles still fronted the main roads. It was crowded, it was poor, it had a bad name and had earned it. It was not yet a labyrinth. And now let us stand out in that street at night, because the night is the reason you are here. It is lit, I said this at the beginning, and I want to give it to you properly now. An Act of 1736 put 4,000 to 5,000 oil lamps across London, and this is the part that mattered. They burned all year round, not merely in the dark winter months as older arrangements had required. Oil lamps on posts with a flame and a reservoir and a wick that needed tending. Not gas. Gas is a century away. The effect was that London in the 1740s was one of the best lit cities in Europe, and travellers said so. Whatever else the gin craze was, it did not take place in a dark city. Moving through that light, the watch, not a police force. There would be no police in London for another 80 years, but watchmen, parishmen, elderly as often as not, with a staff and a lantern. Their round had 3 parts, and the third is the one people forget. They called the hours, they tested the doors, and they checked that the lamps were still burning. That is the man you have been hearing all evening, out under your shutter. And in the smallest hours, another trade entirely. By law, the night soil men could work only between midnight and 5 in the morning, and they worked in teams of 4, with names for each job: a holeman, a ropeman, and 2 tubmen. They emptied the cesspits and carted the contents out to lay stalls at the edge of the city while everyone slept. A whole occupation that existed only in the small hours, moving through a lamplit city on the nights when nobody saw them. And here is the thing that complicates every moral story ever told about these years, and I'm going to set it down without comment. The Fleet Ditch, the foul, half-silted stream on the western edge of the city, the byword for everything filthy about old London, was petitioned to be covered over in 1733 after people fell into it and suffocated in the mud. Sewer arches over it were finished in 1735. And on the 30th of September 1737 a market opened on top of it. All of that is inside the Craze. A Londoner of 1725 and a Londoner of 1740 walked through measurably different cities, more lamps, better covered sewers, a new market where an open ditch had been. The city was getting cleaner and brighter in exactly the decades it was supposedly destroying itself. Both things were happening at once, they usually are. A penny a dram. Everything in this story in the end comes down to a small piece of arithmetic that anybody could do standing at a counter with a coin in their hand. So let us do it slowly. First, what did a person earn? An unskilled labourer on a London building site in the middle decades of the century was on something like 12 pence a day, a shilling. Semi-skilled man, described in the account simply as a labourer but doing work that required knowing something, might be on 16 to 18 pence. Skilled trades earned considerably more. But those are the rates written in the book, and the book flatters. We happen to have unusually good records from the building of Westminster Bridge, which went up across our period, and there the nominal rate was about 19 pence a day, while what men actually took home worked out at nearer 14.5. Contractors took their cut in between, and more importantly, nobody worked every day. There were 313 possible working days in a year, and no labourer in London got near them. Weather stopped the work, illness stopped the work, winter shortened the day, and whole trades simply went quiet for months. So hold a working man's day at somewhere around a shilling, understanding that plenty of days brought nothing at all. Now what did gin cost? By about 1713, finished gin was selling at roughly a penny a dram. The standard retail measure of the trade was the quartern, a quarter of a pint, and you meet it constantly in the court records, because when a witness describes buying spirits, that is the word they use. Put the two numbers side by side, at 12 pence a day, and gin at about a penny a dram. A labourer's entire day's wage bought on the order of a dozen drams of spirit. Say that again, and let it sit. A whole day of work, 12 drams. And then remember the previous chapter, that this was a drink which could render a person insensible almost at once. The distance between having a coin and being unable to stand had collapsed to about the width of one counter and one swallow. I want to be careful here because it is easy to slide from arithmetic into sermon. This does not mean labourers drank 12 drams a day. Almost nobody did, and one of the sturdiest findings of modern research is that the heaviest, most regular customers of the dram shops were not the destitute at all, but skilled workers with money in their pockets. The people the panic literature never mentioned because they did not fit the picture it wanted to paint. What the arithmetic means is narrower and more important, that oblivion had become, for the first time in English history, affordable on a labourer's wage, for anyone who wanted it on any day of the week. And it was affordable because of the tax schedule, not because distillers were kind. 2d a gallon in duty on spirits, against 4 shillings and 9 on strong beer. That gap, which Parliament created and maintained for its own excellent reasons, is what put a dram within reach of a penny. Now the famous line, almost everyone who has heard of the gin craze has heard the sign. Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2d, clean straw for nothing. It is the single most quoted sentence about this period, and I have to be honest with you about it, because it is not what it is usually said to be. It is not a transcribed shop sign. Nobody wrote it down while standing in front of a gin shop looking at a board. 2 sources give it to us. One is Tobias Smollett, writing a continuation of the history of England in 1757 and 58. That is, describing the 1730s some 20 years after the fact, and referring to painted boards in general, not to any particular shop. The other is Hogarth, who lettered it onto a cellar in his print of 1751. So the honest phrasing is this. It is a line that has come down to us from Hogarth and from Smollett, not a sign that hung outside a gin shop. And yet I am not going to throw it away because of the 3rd clause. Clean straw for nothing is independently corroborated, and by a good witness. Archbishop Thomas Secker described gin shops as keeping a cellar strewed every morning with fresh straw, where those that got drunk were thrown. 2 separate lines of evidence arriving from different directions, describing the same arrangement. Think about what that arrangement actually is. It is not charity and it is not cruelty. It is logistics. If your business model is selling a spirit that can put a grown adult on the floor within minutes, then within a week of opening you have a practical problem. There are people on your floor. You cannot serve over them. You cannot leave them in the street in February. So you clear a space below and you put down straw, and every morning you put down fresh straw. And when someone goes down, you and your boy take them by the arms and the ankles and lay them on it until they come round. The fresh straw every morning is the detail that undoes you if you let it. It means it happened often enough to require a routine. Somebody had a job first thing of raking out yesterday's straw and laying tomorrow's. The way a stable is mucked out, because that quantity of unconsciousness had become an ordinary daily fact of doing business. That, more than any number, is what a penny a dram meant. Let us come back up out of the cellar, though because the picture would be false if we left it there. The vast majority of the 6,000 transactions happening across Middlesex on any given evening ended with nothing at all. A woman buying a quartern to take home, a porter having a dram against the cold at the end of a shift on the river, an old man at a chandler's counter with his ha'porth of cheese and his measure of spirit going home. Ordinary purchases of an ordinary commodity made ordinary by a tax schedule. And behind the counter, taking the penny more often than the story usually allows, a woman, and we will come to her shortly. The names they gave it. Before we get to the laws, spend a little while with the language, because the names people gave this drink tell you more about how they felt about it than any pamphlet does. The Ipswich Journal in October 1736 Right in the middle of everything, as you will see, printed a list of the names under which gin was going about. 4 of them stand out: Cuckold's Comfort, Makeshift, The Lady's Delight, Sangree. And other sources give more: Bob, Colic Water, Gripe Water, The Balk, Tow-Row, King Theodore of Corsica, Juniper Water, Madam Geneva, Mother Gin. I should be straight with you. Some of these are almost certainly jokes circulated in print rather than words painted on a real board. Cuckold's Comfort in particular has the ring of a newspaper's wit rather than a shopkeeper's sign. So take them as reported names, as what people said gin was called, which is its own kind of evidence. And listen to what they are doing. Colic Water and Gripe Water are pretending to be medicine. Gripe Water is a real thing, a remedy for a baby's stomach, and calling gin by that name is a wink. I am buying this for my health, you understand. There was no medicinal exemption in law. That is a story people tell, and it is not true, but there did not need to be one. The name did the work. It let a purchase be described in front of a neighbour as something other than what it was. The Lady's Delight is doing something else and something sharper, and we will come back to it in a moment. King Theodore of Corsica is a piece of pure topical mockery. Theodore was a real and extremely short-lived king of Corsica, whose reign was a European joke of the day. Naming your gin after him is naming it after a monarch nobody takes seriously. Madam Geneva is the great one, and the one that lasted. She was never a person. She was a personification, a made-up lady, gin's answer to John Barleycorn, who stands for the barley in a beer song. People wrote about Madam Geneva as though she had a character, and moods, and enemies in Parliament. They wrote her a mock elegy. In 1736 they would carry her coffin through the streets. And that is a mark of a thing that has become genuinely central to a culture. You know, something has taken deep root when people start giving it a name and a gender and a personality and mourning it in verse. And she was mourned properly in verse before she was even dead. In June of 1736, while the great act was still only coming, the Gentleman's Magazine printed a mock elegy called The Downfall of Mother Gin, in which she is described, with a straight face and a wink behind it, as a good old lady. Hold on to that little printed sheet. It has a long way to travel yet, and it will turn up in the strangest place 15 years from now, slipping out of a dying man's basket in the most famous engraving of the century. Some of the other names are simply the sound of the street, and I like them for that, Bob. Tow-Row, The Balk, Makeshift. They are not clever, and they were not meant to be. They are the shorthand of people who bought the same thing at the same counter, often enough to have stopped using its proper name. The way any group of people who do a thing daily eventually invents a word for it that nobody outside would recognize. That, more than the satirical names, is the real evidence of how ordinary this had become. Cuckold's Comfort tells you what a newspaper wit thought. Bob tells you what a porter said on a Tuesday. But the best name of all is Parliament Brandy, and it is the best because it is not really a joke about drink at all. It is a joke about legal drafting. Here is what happened. The first act against gin in 1729 had to define what it was taxing. That is harder than it sounds. How do you write in law the sentence that catches gin and nothing else? What the draftsman settled on was a definition by ingredient. Spirits compounded with juniper berries or other fruit, spices or ingredients. You can see the flaw from here, and so could the trade. The distillers simply left the juniper out, and the spices and everything else on the list. They sold the plain, unflavoured, undisguised spirit. which now fell outside the statutory definition of the thing the statute forbade, and they gave the result a name that made the point as loudly as possible. Parliament, brandy, brandy by courtesy of Parliament. Here is your law, gentlemen, here is what it produced. That is the entire history of the Gin Acts in miniature, and it happens at the very first attempt. The law defined the drink, so the trade undefined it. Every subsequent act would run into some version of the same wall. A rule precise enough to be enforced was precise enough to be walked around, and there were thousands of people with an immediate financial interest in finding the gap, and perhaps 20 with any interest in closing it. And then there is Ladies' Delight, which I set aside a moment ago, because it points at the thing the 18th century found most disturbing about all of this. Not that men drank, men had always drunk, in alehouses, in the open, in a way society had 400 years of machinery for handling. What unsettled people, deeply and articulately and at length, was women. Women buying, women selling, women drinking, and women, this is the part that really did the damage, doing it away from any supervision at a grocer's counter in the middle of the day and taking it home. The names knew it before the pamphlets did. Ladies' Delight is not an affectionate phrase. It is a warning wearing a smile. The women who sold it. This chapter needs one number to be held next to another, and once you have the two of them side by side, the whole moral story of the gin craze looks different. Here is the first number. Of London's gin retailers, fewer than 1 in 5 were women. 472 out of 2,377. In the sample, historians have been able to reconstruct under 20%. The trade was, by a wide margin, a men's trade. And here is the second. Of the people actually prosecuted for gin offences, roughly 70% were women. 641 out of 925. Under 20% of the sellers, 70% of the defendants. That gap is not a fact about drinking, it is a fact about enforcement. And it is the trap that the entire tradition of writing about this subject fell into for the better part of a century. Because when you open the court records, what you find is women, page after page of women, and if you take court records as a photograph of a society, you will conclude that gin was a women's phenomenon. It was not. Court records are not a photograph of a society. They are a photograph of what a society chose to prosecute. Go one step further into the figures and it gets sharper. Of those 641 women, 628 were single or widowed, and of the 586 offenders too poor to pay their fines at all, 438 were women. So the person the machinery of the law was actually catching, over and over, was a woman without a husband and without money. Not the malt distiller with parliamentary friends. Not the compounder in the back room with his oil of turpentine and his printed manual. Her. Why was she selling gin in the first place? That question has a good answer, and it is the warmest thing in this chapter. Petty gin retailing required almost no capital. You did not need premises, a basket would do. You did not need stock in any quantity. You could buy small and sell smaller. And crucially, you did not need a guild. 18th century London was full of trades. A woman was formally barred from, or effectively barred from, by companies that would not admit her. Selling gin was not one of them. It was one of the very few ways a woman could earn independently without asking anyone's permission. The formal end of the trade shows you the contrast exactly. The London Company of Distillers, the respectable chartered body, admitted 4 women in the entire period from 1721 to 1759. 4 in 38 years. The formal trade was closed. The street trade was wide open. And think about what no capital really means for a person in that position. To set up in almost any other trade you needed premises or tools or stock, or an apprenticeship you could not have served, or the goodwill of a company that would not have you. To set up selling gin you needed a bottle and a measure and somewhere to stand. You could begin on a Monday with what you had in your hand. You could stop when you were ill and start again when you were better. And your customers were your own neighbours, on your own corner, which is why when the informers came, the neighbours knew perfectly well who was being taken. And some women did rather more than survive in it. There were women who became established distillers in their own right, with their names in the records of the Middlesex Sessions and the King's Bench, Mary Googe of Middlesex, Catherine Croft of St. George's. Not many, but they existed, and they were doing business under their own names in a century that gave women very few ways to do that. Which brings us to what was really being objected to. Something changed in how England talked about women and drink between the 1600s and the 1730s, and the change is stark. In the 17th century, when moralists wrote about drink and women, the woman was the victim, the wife of the drunkard, the one who suffered. By the 1730s, she is the villain. The same literature that had pitied her now blamed her. Underneath that, the historians who have looked hardest at this material see an anxiety that is not really about gin at all, the fear that women might abandon their natural station. A woman with an independent income, however small from a trade nobody could bar her from, was a woman who did not need anybody's permission. That was the disturbance. And the response could be extraordinary. In January 1737, the Grub Street Journal ran a proposal that liquor of any kind should simply be banned from sale to women. Not restricted, not licensed, banned by sex. Stranger still, there was a small pseudo-scientific panic running alongside. Reports circulated of 13 women, French, Danish and English, who had spontaneously combusted after drinking large quantities of spirits. Burst into flame, and note who the risk was said to apply to: women, and particularly the old women who hawked gin in the streets. It is hard not to hear underneath that something a great deal older than the 18th century, the old woman with her potions at the roadside, and the fire that used to be prescribed for her. So let me end this chapter where the evidence honestly ends it, which is somewhere much kinder than where the pamphlets ended it. For a great many older women, the gin trade was not ruin, it was a living. A woman whose eyes had gone, or whose hands had stiffened, could no longer live by the needle, and sewing was the standard female occupation of the age, the thing you fell back on. When the needle failed, there was very little else. There was the parish, and there was begging. Or there was a basket and a quartern measure, and a few pence turned over on a corner in Shoreditch, and your own roof for another month. Whatever else that was, it was independence. And when the acts came, and the informers came, it was very largely her they came for. The first attempts. The complaints came before the laws, as they usually do, and they came from the two groups of people who saw the results with their own eyes, magistrates and physicians. Magistrates went first. In 1721, 8 years before any act, the Middlesex justices declared that gin was the principal cause of all the vice and debauchery among, in their words, the inferior sort of people. Hear the phrase properly. The inferior sort of people. That is not an aside, that is the frame. From the very first official complaint, the problem is not defined as drinking. It is defined as drinking by the wrong sort. Gentlemen drank a great deal in this century, in quantities that would appall us, and nobody proposed an Act of Parliament about it. What alarmed the bench was that the labouring poor had acquired access to something that made them, in the magistrates' view, ungovernable and unemployable. Keep that in your pocket. It explains the shape of every law that follows. Then the physicians. In the winter of 1725 to 26, the date is written two ways in the records. For calendar reasons that need not detain us, the Royal College of Physicians resolved to petition the House of Commons about spirituous liquors, and the petition was presented by Dr. John Frynd, who was both a physician and a Member of Parliament. Their language is worth having, because it is not the language of hysteria. Spirits, they said, rendered people diseased, not fit for business, poor, a burthen to themselves and neighbours, and they blamed spirits for weak, feeble, and distempered children. These were the best doctors in England describing what they saw in front of them. We will come back to them near the end of tonight, when we look at what they could and could not have known. And it was not all one way. Opinion in the 1720s was genuinely divided, and some of the division is delicious. Daniel Defoe, the same Defoe, argued in 1726 on behalf of the distillers, making the case that the trade was a national good because it consumed the farmers' worst grain. He later changed his mind and wrote against gin. The 18th century did not have a settled view. It was arguing with itself the whole way through. It is worth noticing the rhythm of the complaint too, because it did not run continuously. Historians who have mapped the agitation find it coming in waves, a burst in 1726, another in 1728 and 29, a much larger one from 1735 to 38, and a final one from 1748 to 51. Between the waves, comparative quiet. That is how public alarm usually behaves. It is not a rising tide, but a series of storms, each one gathering pamphlets and sermons and petitions and grand jury presentments around itself, breaking against Parliament, and then subsiding while everyone goes back to their ordinary business. 3 of those 4 waves produced legislation. All of them produced print. But by 1729 the consumption figure had reached 1 3/10 gallons a head, and Parliament acted. The Act of 1729 did 2 things. It imposed an annual licence of £20 on anyone retailing spirits, and it laid an excise duty of 5 shillings a gallon. £20 was a serious sum, far beyond a woman with a basket, and beyond most chandlers too. On paper, it should have swept the small trade away overnight. It did not, for 3 reasons that between them make up a short course in why legislation fails. The first was exemptions. The Act carried them, and they were wide, and wide exemptions are doors. Whatever category was not covered became immediately the category everybody was in. The second was the definition problem we met in the last chapter. The Act described the taxable drink by its ingredients, juniper berries or other fruit, spices or ingredients, and the distillers responded by removing them, selling unflavoured spirit and calling it Parliament brandy. The Act now taxed a product nobody was making. And the third was the deepest, and it never went away. There was no means of stopping an illicit retailer. Consider what enforcement would actually have required. There was no police force. None would exist for another century. There were parish constables who were ordinary local men serving a term of duty, and who lived among the people they would have had to arrest. There was the watch, whose job was doors and lamps and hours. There were excise officers who were few, and whose ordinary business was ledgers and warehouses, not raiding kitchens. Against them stood several thousand sellers, most of whom needed only a bottle and a doorway to be back in business the following morning. So consumption dipped and then resumed, and by 1733 the Act was in political trouble, but not from the direction you would expect. It was not repealed because it was unenforceable. It was repealed because it was working just well enough to be felt in the countryside. The landowners noticed if the Act discouraged distilling, then it discouraged the purchase of grain. And if it discouraged the purchase of grain, then the market for the meanest part of their harvest thinned. They brought pressure for repeal, the phrase used by historians of Parliament, and in 1733 they got it. 4 years, and the first Gin Act was gone, undone by the same interest that had commissioned the whole policy in 1690. That is the cleanest statement of the politics of this entire story, and it is why I keep returning to grain rather than to morality. There were, running through Parliament for 60 years, 2 coalitions. On one side, magistrates, physicians, city reformers, clergy and pamphleteers who wanted the trade suppressed. On the other, the landed interest, the malt distillers, and quietly and decisively the Treasury, which had wars to pay for and did not care to break a revenue stream. For most of the period, the second coalition won. It won in 1733. It would win again more dramatically in 1743. And it would only stop winning when its own foundation crumbled, which happened, as we will see, in a wheat field rather than a chamber. Meanwhile, the figure went on climbing, and the reformers went away to think again. And what they came back with in 1736 was not a tax. It was something much closer to a declaration of war. The Act nobody obeyed. The Act of 1736 is the most famous of the 8, and it deserves its fame, because it is the moment the state stopped trying to manage the gin trade and tried instead to abolish it. It received the royal assent on the 5th of May 1736, and it was to come into force on the 29th of September, Michaelmas, one of the quarter days on which the English year turned. 4.5 months' notice. Everyone knew exactly when it was coming. It had 3 teeth. A duty of 20 shillings a gallon, not 5, 20. An annual licence of £50 to retail spirits. And a minimum unit of sale. You could not legally sell less than 2 gallons at a time. That third clause is the one aimed at the heart of things, because it was designed not to tax the dram trade, but to make it impossible. Nobody buys 2 gallons of gin for a penny. The Act was attempting to convert a retail trade into a wholesale one by fiat, and thereby to put every counter and every basket in London out of business on a single September morning. The £50 licence has become the symbol of the whole thing, and to feel it, you need it in the right units. Do not convert it into modern money. The conversions for the 1730s vary by an order of magnitude and tell you nothing. Put it in wages instead. £50 was roughly 14 months' earnings for a skilled man in the gin trade. 14 months' wages paid up front every year for permission to sell. That is not a licence fee. That is prohibition with a price tag attached so that it can be called something else. And here is the part that spoils the tidy story, and which I love for exactly that reason. The government did not want this Act. The 20-shilling duty was the work of Sir Joseph Jekyll, a reforming master of the roles of formidable rectitude. The £50 licence was not even in the original design. It was a clause added late in the passage of the bill. And Sir Robert Walpole, the great political manager of the age, the man whose government it was, opposed prohibitive taxation of gin. He opposed it for reasons that were entirely characteristic. The revenue was useful to the government, the trade was useful to the landed interest, and Walpole's genius was for not picking fights. But the moral tide in the Commons was running hard, and he felt obliged to accept Jekyll's bill, which is to say the harshest anti-gin law in English history was passed by a government that did not believe in it, at the insistence of a backbench conscience, and its most notorious clause was an afterthought. Now let us go to the 29th of September, 1736, because the night the Act came into force is the strangest and quietest thing in this whole story. In the weeks beforehand, London made its feelings known, and it did so with a kind of theatrical wit that is very much of that city. Gin shops and punch sellers draped their signs and their shop fronts in black crepe, mourning cloth, the real thing, the fabric you hung out when somebody had died. Punch bowls were painted black. A procession of distillers marched to the excise office, and in Swallow Street, in Soho, somebody organised a mock funeral and a wake for Madame Geneva herself. Prints were printed and sold, one an anonymous satire in the form of a funerary monument to the mortal memory of Madame Geneva, who died September the 29th, 1736, with a toothless old woman drinking from a barrel at its foot, and figures labelled as the deceased lady's weeping servant. Another, by an engraver named John Clark, showed her funeral procession, publicans and a beggar walking behind her coffin. Two different prints, made by different hands for the same joke. And underneath the joke, the government was genuinely frightened. Letters had been intercepted warning of a rising, organised under a code word, Sir Robert and Sir Joseph, which is to say the two men held responsible, Walpole and Jekyll. Ministers took it seriously. Walpole and other senior figures left London days before the 29th. 300 lifeguards and grenadiers were posted in Covent Garden. The guard at Kensington Palace was double. Detachments were placed in Hyde Park and out through the suburbs of Westminster. A capital city braced itself, with troops in its squares, for the night a drink became illegal. Nothing happened. There was black crepe, there was a mock funeral, and the people who held the one in Swallow Street were arrested 2 days later. There was a great deal of drinking, some of it defiant, and scattered disorder of the kind any large city produces on any night, with an occasion attached. And that was all. No rising, no barricades. The soldiers stood about in Covent Garden in the September dark, and the lamps burned, and the watch went round calling the hours and testing the doors, and by 2 in the morning London had done what London does. It went to bed. I find that the most restful moment in this entire history, and I want to leave you inside it for a moment. A city that has been told to expect a rebellion and simply does not have one, the soldiers with nothing to do, the empty squares, the crepe hanging wet on the shop fronts, and the light of 4,000 oil lamps lying on the puddles, and everyone asleep. Because the resistance to this act was never going to look like a rising. It was going to look like something far more effective, and it had already begun. Consider the one statistic that tells you what the act achieved. Over the whole life of the 1736 Act, 20 licenses were taken out. 20 in a city where magistrates had counted more than 6,000 cellars. The entire revenue raised by the great £50 licence was £500. 20 out of 6,000. Everybody else simply carried on. And so, Parliament, having discovered that its law was being ignored by an entire population, reached for the only tool it had left. If the state could not see into 6,000 back rooms, then it would pay the neighbours to look for it. The informers and the mobs. Here is the mechanism, and it is worth setting out precisely, because everything that follows grows out of it like a plant out of a crack. Selling spirits without a licence brought a fine of £10. That fine was split in half. half to the overseers of the poor of the parish, and half to whoever had laid the information. £5 to the informer. £5. Against a labourer's shilling a day, that is something like 3 months' wages for one afternoon's work. And the work was almost nothing. You went into a shop, you bought a dram, a penny, you drank it or you did not. You went to a magistrate and swore what you had seen. That was it. The purchase was the evidence, and you were the witness. In 1737, an amendment went further and empowered the excise office to pay rewards on convictions directly. That amendment, rather than the great act of the previous year, is what turned informing from an occasional civic act into an industry. About 200 people took it up. An independent count for Westminster alone, across 1737 to 1741, finds 198 of them. And they were not mostly what you would imagine. There was no organised ring, no professional class of thief-takers. Most informers informed exactly once, an isolated, opportunistic act by an ordinary poor person who needed £5. What organisation existed was a kind of clearing-house, and its function tells you everything about the pressure they were under. It matched informers to neighbourhoods where they were not known, because in your own street you would be recognised, and if you were recognised you would be beaten. There are at least 57 documented attacks on informers between 1737 and 1742. 7 major riots, and at least 4 informers beaten to death. I want to give you those real numbers rather than the inflated ones you may have heard, because they are smaller and far more affecting. You will read that hardly a day passed without an informer being killed. That is not true, and it does not need to be. 57 attacks in 5 years is a street that has decided something. 4 deaths is 4 deaths. The crowds did not stop at informers. On at least 9 occasions, people gathered at the houses of magistrates or outside the excise office itself. 3 times at the house of Thomas de Vale, the most active justice in Westminster, and they had a chant. And the chant is a remarkable thing to hear coming out of the 18th century, because it puts the drink and the crown in the same breath. No gin, no king. Let me take you to one night, because we have it in detail, the 23rd of January, 1738. De Vale had issued a warrant for a man named Edward Arnold, who had threatened to kill an informer called Martha Beasley. Beasley, frightened, took refuge in De Vale's own house, and a crowd came over 1,000 people in the street outside a magistrate's door in the middle of Westminster, among them urging them on a man named Roger Allen. De Vale read the riot act from his own window, and the military were sent for. Allen was arrested, and here the authorities did something clever, or thought they did. They tried him not at the Old Bailey, but at King's Bench, deliberately, in order to avoid a London jury, who could not be relied upon to convict a man for shouting at a magistrate about gin. It did not work. A prodigious mob, in the words of the report, attended the trial, and the jury acquitted him. When he was discharged there was, we are told, a universal huzzah, and Roger Allen was carried out of the court in triumph on the shoulders of the crowd. And afterwards he said, "The thing that I would like you to fall asleep remembering, because it is the funniest and most human sentence in this entire history." His acquittal, Allen said, had preserved the great liberty of mobbing a justice now and then. The great liberty of mobbing a justice now and then, as though it were an ancient constitutional right, alongside trial by jury and the freedom of the press. There is a whole national character folded up in that line. But not all of the resistance was loud, and the quiet forms did more damage to the act than the noisy ones. In August 1738, a woman named Sarah Miller stopped an informer, Anne Adams, in the street and denounced her in front of everybody for living off informations, and 20 or 30 bystanders joined in. Not a riot, a public shaming, which in a neighbourhood is a heavier instrument. Next year, Catherine Norton prosecuted a gin seller. She was afterwards tried herself for perjury and acquitted, and then found that her neighbours would have nothing to do with her, as one that laid informations against people. No violence, just exile among the people she had to live among for the rest of her life. And the parish officers, the overseers of the poor who were entitled to half of every fine, quietly began giving the money back. Convicted sellers who were poor found their fines returned to them by the very officials who had collected them. The Middlesex bench condemned the practice, stating that it was illegal and done, they said, with some acidity, upon pretence of their being poor. I think that is the heart of the whole enforcement story, and it is not in any of the riots. The state passed a law, and the neighbours would not do it. Not the crowd, the church wardens. The respectable men of the parish, holding office, doing the paperwork, and then handing the money back across the table to a woman who could not afford to lose it. Meanwhile, the machine was rotting from inside. The arithmetic that destroyed it is beautifully simple. Most convicted sellers were too poor to pay a £10 fine. But the informer was still owed his £5. So the state was paying out on convictions that brought in no money at all, over and over. And by 1739 the commissioners had simply run out of funds to pay informers with, and the informers themselves turned out to be exactly what everyone suspected. Of the 63 most active, 19, nearly a third, were themselves prosecuted, 7 for extortion, 12 for perjury. And the conviction rates are extraordinary. 17 out of 26 perjury defendants convicted, 14 out of 15 extortion defendants convicted. London juries who would not convict a woman for selling a dram would convict an informer without blinking. Even the chief enforcer went. Edward Parker, the excise officer at the centre of it all, reported after Allen's acquittal that his witnesses had become terrified and would no longer appear in court. And then in December 1738, Parker himself was exposed as corrupt, having pocketed fines that were owed to the parishes. Prosecutions declined significantly afterwards. And I have to give you one night that shows why the city had stopped trusting any of it, and I'm going to state it plainly and move on. On the 15th of July 1742, constables in St. Martin's Lane shut around 20 women into a cell about 6 feet square. By morning 4 were dead and 6 in all. Constable William Bird and others were tried at the Old Bailey that October, sentenced to death, and had their sentences commuted to transportation. The crowd pulled the building down. Horace Walpole, who was not a sentimental man, wrote that the greatest criminals in this town are the officers of justice. That was the state of enforcement by 1742, and it is a large part of why what came next came next. Because the 1736 Act did not die of argument. In 1743, Parliament reversed it almost completely. The licence was cut from £50 to 20 shillings. Duties and penalties were sharply reduced, and most significantly, the reward provisions were eliminated outright. The informer economy was dismantled by statute. And the reason was not compassion, and not public health. It was money. England was in the middle of the War of the Austrian Succession, and, in the flat phrase of the parliamentary historians, the acute demands of military expenditure secured the repeal of the 1736 legislation. A gin trade you have taxed is a gin trade that pays for soldiers. A gin trade you have driven underground pays for nothing at all. The most draconian gin law in English history was undone by a war. By then it hardly mattered. The justices, once the disorders were under control, had returned to what one historian calls their more usual lethargy. Constables would not arrest. The commissioners were reducing fines and obstructing informers. Magistrates had stopped encouraging prosecutions. Enforcement collapsed at every level at once, not through one dramatic defeat, but through several thousand people, at every rank from churchwarden to commissioner, deciding independently that they would rather not. There had been 435 excise convictions by March 1738, along with several hundred street sellers punished summarily. It was not nothing. It was also, against 6,000 sellers, nothing. And consumption, there was a dip in 1737. By 1740 it was higher than it had been before the Act. The authorities accepted in writing that dram drinking could not be eliminated. One last casualty, and it says something. The Societies for the Reformation of Manners, the great voluntary moral policing movement that had been prosecuting vice in London for 50 years, were destroyed by these years. Their prosecutions fell to a quarter of what they had been in the early 1720s. Their annual report of 1738 was their last. The people who study this period have a phrase for what a bounty system does to a neighbourhood. It creates enormous stresses within the community targeted, forcing everyone in it to choose between solidarity with their neighbours, collaboration with the authorities, or isolation from both. London chose solidarity overwhelmingly, and the law lost. Which is, when you look at it, the honest summary of the whole affair. Popular resistance destroyed the 1736 Act, not the repeal debates. Ordinary people simply made it unenforceable, and then Parliament caught up. Puss and Mew. Go back a few years, though, to the middle of the Informer years, because the trade's answer to all of this was not violence. The best of it was ingenuity, and one piece of ingenuity is so perfect that it has outlived every statute in this story. Start with the ordinary evasions, which were unglamorous and effective. The Act had killed the named drink, so the trade sold unnamed drinks, Parliament brandy again, and sangry, and whatever else fell outside the definition of the moment. The Act had imposed a 2-gallon minimum unit of sale, so the trade defeated it with bookkeeping. You could not sell less than 2 gallons, so you sold 2 gallons on long-term credit over and over to the same customers, delivering a quartern at a time and marking it down against a running account that would be settled at some indefinite point in a hypothetical future. The wholesale threshold became a fiction maintained in a ledger. Nobody ever handed over 2 gallons, and nobody ever intended to. But the elegant solution was of a different order altogether, because it did not evade the law. It attacked the law's evidence. Think about what an informer actually had to swear to. Not that gin was sold in a house, that would be worthless. He had to name the person who sold it. That is what the statute required, and that is what a magistrate needed before he could convict anybody. A name, a person, a seller identified by a witness who saw them do it. Which means, if the buyer never sees the seller, there is no case. And here, from a newspaper of February 1738, is what people in London were actually doing about it. A buyer would come up to a house or a shutter or a wall in a court where a wooden cat's head had been fixed. He would put his mouth near it and say quietly one word: "Puss." And from somewhere inside, behind the shutter, behind the wall, in a room he could not see into, a voice would answer. Then the buyer put his money in a drawer or a slot, and the drawer went in, and after a moment there was a small sound of something being poured, and gin came out to him through a lead pipe running out under the wooden cat's paw. He held his measure under it, or his mouth, and then he walked away, having bought spirits from someone he had never seen and could not describe. I find that this is the moment in the story that people never forget afterwards, and I think it is because of the words, not a code, not a password with any menace in it. Puss, Mew, a joke shared through a wall between two strangers in a city where you could be beaten in the street for saying the wrong thing about gin. Now, who invented it? There is a claim, and I will give it to you with its caveats attached, because the caveats are entertaining in themselves. A man named Dudley Bradstreet, an Irish adventurer, a professional chancer, a man whose whole life was a series of schemes, claimed in a memoir published in 1755 that the machine was his. He says he worked out from reading the Act that a conviction required the informer to name the seller. He had a friend, a lawyer, rent a house for him in Blue Anchor Alley, in Moorfields, so that his own name did not appear on the lease. He laid in stock. He nailed up a wooden cat's head against the wall, ran a lead pipe out under its paw, and waited. And by his own account it was a triumph. He says the crowds coming to his cat was so great that his neighbours could scarcely get in or out of their houses. He says he ran it for about 3 months before imitators appeared all over London and the profits collapsed. Now, the caveats. Bradstreet's only source for this story is Bradstreet. He is an unreliable narrator of a fairly spectacular kind. The same memoir also claims that he personally stopped the Jacobite rising of 1745. So the honest phrasing is, a man named Dudley Bradstreet later claimed to have devised it. But, and this is what matters, the device itself does not depend on him at all. It is independently attested in the press in February 1738, complete with the Puss and the Mew and the drawer and the invisible cell. Whoever thought of it first? London was doing it. And there is something rather appropriate about a machine designed to conceal its operator having a disputed inventor. Sit for a moment with what it represents, though, because it is the neatest summary of the whole 22 years. Parliament had brought against the gin trade the full weight of the 18th century state. A prohibitive duty, a £50 licence, a minimum unit of sale, a bounty system, soldiers in Covent Garden, the Riot Act read from a magistrate's window, and eventually the power to arrest a neighbour on a private citizen's word. And the trade beat it with a carved cat and a length of pipe. Not by force, not by riot, the riots, if anything, hardened the government's resolve. It beat the law by finding the one small joint in it where the evidence had to pass from the world into the courtroom, and quietly putting a wall across that joint. No seller seen, no seller named, no conviction. There is a whole philosophy of law hidden in that, and the 18th century learned it the expensive way. A statute is only as strong as the testimony that can be brought under it, and any rule specific enough to convict people is specific enough to be designed around by people who think about it harder than the draftsman did. The distillers had thousands of clever, motivated minds working full-time on the problem. The excise had a few dozen officers and a budget it had already run out of. So the cat stayed on the wall and the pipe ran under its paw, and somewhere behind the plaster a person nobody could describe poured a quartern for a penny and said Mew. And the greatest legislative effort of the age came to a full stop against a piece of carved wood. Bottom of it, there is one case that everybody who tells this story tells, and I am going to tell it once, plainly and briefly. Then I am going to tell you the part that almost nobody includes, which is the part that matters most. In February of 1734, a woman named Judith Defoe was tried at the Old Bailey. She was a silk throster from Spitalfields, from the French-descended weaving families who had settled that quarter. She had a daughter of 2 years old called Mary, who was being kept in the Bethnal Green workhouse. Judith Defoe went to the workhouse and obtained her daughter by forgery. She brought a note that the churchwarden had not written. She took the child away, and with another woman she killed her, and they sold the child's clothes. She was convicted and hanged at Tyburn on the 8th of March, 1734. I am not going to describe any of it further. There is nothing in the detail that you need, and nothing in it that belongs in a room where someone is falling asleep. But there are 3 things in the record that do belong here, and the first is a number. The clothes a coat, a pair of stays, a petticoat and stockings, sold for 16 pence, and the 16 pence was split between the 2 women. A murdered child's entire wardrobe, everything she owned in the world, was worth about 1 labourer's day. That number, more than anything else in this account, tells you the economic floor these lives were standing on, not gin. The floor. The second thing is that her mother testified in her defence, and what she said was this: she never was in her right mind, but was always roving. A defence of insanity was raised and rejected. The court did not have the concepts or the will or the machinery for it. But her mother stood up in the Old Bailey and said that about her daughter, and it went into the record, and it is still there, in a document that is otherwise unbearable, that is the human thing, and it deserves saying aloud. The third is that the other woman was never caught. She is known in the record only as Suki. She was never identified and never tried. Judith Defoe insisted throughout that Suki was equally guilty, and she hanged alone. Now the correction, which is the reason this chapter exists. This case is quoted endlessly as the emblem of the gin craze. It appears in pamphlets from the 1730s onward as the proof of what gin did to people, and it is not what the record says. Read the order of events in the trial. The child was strangled to stop her crying while she was being stripped. The clothes were then sold, and with part of the money, part of the 16 pence, a quartern of gin was bought. Gin appears at the end of that sequence, not at the beginning. It is not a cause in the record. It is the last item on a list of what the money went on. And the strongest evidence that this is a later interpretation comes from the man best placed to make the gin argument at the time, and who did not make it. The ordinary of Newgate, the prison chaplain, whose job was to interview the condemned and publish an account of their lives, and who had every professional incentive to draw a moral, blamed what he called the sin of uncleanness. Sexual immorality, that was his framing. In 1734, from the man who actually spoke to her. Gin is barely mentioned. The gin reading was applied afterwards by pamphleteers in the run-up to legislation 2 years later and more. The case became evidence for an argument it had not originally been part of. That is worth sitting with, because it is the pattern of the whole subject in a single file. Something real and terrible happened. It is recorded carefully, and then, some years later, when a political argument needs an illustration, the terrible thing is picked up and turned slightly, so that the light falls on the part that suits, and it is put in a pamphlet, and after 200 years everybody knows the story, and nobody has read the record. You will meet the same case again in a picture, though even that is less certain than it is usually made to sound. When Hogarth drew the mother on the steps in Gin Lane, letting her child fall, scholars think he may have had Judith Defoe in mind. May have. He never said so. It is an inference, and a reasonable one, and it is not a documented fact. And what should we take from the case itself? Not that gin drove a woman to kill her child. The record does not support that and does not claim it. What it shows is a woman whose own mother believed she had never been in her right mind, living at the very bottom of the poorest quarter of the largest city in Europe, in a world with no provision at all for what was wrong with her, and where a child's whole wardrobe came to 16 pence. Gin was in that world cheaply and everywhere. So was destitution and untreated illness, and a workhouse you could take a child out of with a forged note, and a gallows at the end of it all. There is no lesson to draw. There is only the record and one sentence from her mother, and then we can leave it and let it be quiet again. The panic in print. By the end of the 1740s, gin had become an argument, and the argument was being fought where 18th century arguments were fought, in print. Pamphlets, sermons, petitions, tables of figures, and eventually 2 engravings that would fix the whole subject in the English imagination for 3 centuries. Let us go through the campaign in order, because it is a campaign, and it was extremely well run. The first great pamphlet had come earlier, 1736, in the run-up to the Great Act. It was called Distilled Spirituous Liquors, the Bane of the Nation, and it is usually attributed to Thomas Wilson, though some scholars have suggested Stephen Hales, and the safe thing is to say the attribution is not certain. What is interesting about it is the order of its arguments, which is not the order you would expect. It has 3 legs. There is a physical account of what spirits do to the body. There is an account of the disorder they cause. And first, before either of those, there is an economic argument, that the landed interest actually loses money by distilling. That is the leg that goes first, because that is the audience. If you want to move Parliament in 1736, you do not begin by describing a sick child. You begin by telling the country gentlemen that this business is costing them. The pamphlet also did something clever with evidence. It printed as an appendix the presentments of the grand juries of London, Middlesex, and the Tower Hamlets, bundling in the formal complaints of the legal system as though they were independent testimony. The panic was quoting itself and calling it proof. Then, 15 years later, in January 1751, Henry Fielding published an enquiry into the causes of the late increase of robbers. Fielding is worth pausing on. He was a novelist of the first rank, and also a working magistrate in Westminster, a man who saw the material every day from the bench. His phrasing has stuck because he was a writer. A new kind of drunkenness, he wrote, unknown to our ancestors, is lately sprung up amongst us, and elsewhere, flatly, that poison called gin. But read the whole thing, and its argument is not about health, and it is barely about suffering. It is about public order and labour. Fielding's concern is that gin disqualified men from honest work and drove them to theft, that it was manufacturing robbers, which is what the title says. And at one point he asks a question that gives the whole game away, because it is not about the children at all. He wonders what such children will become. Are these, he asks, to be our future sailors and our future grenadiers? Sailors and grenadiers. There is the actual anxiety in 6 words. England in 1751 was a country that needed an inexhaustible supply of cheap, strong, biddable men to put in ships and regiments and workshops, and the fear was that gin was spoiling the supply. Alongside Fielding came Corbin Morris, who did the same thing quantitatively. His observations on the past growth and present state of the City of London, also 1751, argued the case in tables, christenings and burials in the city, laid out year by year from 1601 to 1750. The gin panic was conducted at its most sophisticated, in the language of political arithmetic, counting bodies and counting births and drawing conclusions from the gap between them. And here is a genuinely strange consequence. The gin panic helped invent British demography. Morris went on 2 years later to draft a bill for the registration of births. The argument about gin had run so hard into the limits of what anybody actually knew about the population of England that it produced a demand for real statistics. We will see near the end of tonight just how badly those statistics were needed. Not everyone panicked. It is worth one line for the sake of fairness. Josiah Tucker published in the same year an impartial enquiry into the benefits and damages arising to the nation from the present, very great use of low-priced spirituous liquors. Read the title Impartial, Benefits and Damages. A calmer, more economic voice, and one taken seriously enough that a copy sat in Adam Smith's own library. And then, in February 1751, about a month after Fielding's enquiry, William Hogarth published 2 prints. Beer Street and Gin Lane were issued as a deliberate pair. The plate carries the line, published according to Act of Parliament, February the 1st, 1751. The price was 1 shilling. 1 and 6pence for a finer impression, and they were advertised in the London Evening Post in the middle of February. Hogarth designed and engraved them himself, unusually for him. There are no paintings of either scene, only the prints. They were published from his own house, the Golden Head in Leicester Fields. The cheapness was the point. 1 shilling was deliberately low for Hogarth, and it was low because he wanted them to reach the urban poor and to be pinned up in taverns and coffee houses. He was not making art for collectors, he was making posters, and they appeared a month after his friend Fielding's pamphlet, and both works supported the same bill which would pass that summer. These are campaign documents, not neutral observation of London. That distinction matters because for 200 years Gin Lane has been used as though it were a photograph. Look at what is actually in it. The setting is St. Giles in the Fields. The spire in the distance is not the parish church, it is Hawksmoor's St. George's, Bloomsbury, and it is drawn faint and far away at the edge of things. And directly in front of it, higher in the composition, hangs the pawnbroker's sign, 3 balls, set against the spire. The arrangement makes an inverted cross. Hogarth is telling you what this parish worships, and it is not the church. The pawnbroker's name is Gripe. Look at what he is taking in pawn, a carpenter's saw and a housewife's cooking pots, the tools of a trade and the means of feeding a family, going across the counter for the price of a drink. The distiller's name is Kilman. In fact, only 3 businesses prosper anywhere in the picture: the pawnbroker, the distiller, and the undertaker. Everything else is failing, collapsing, or dead. The composition is an argument in itself. Gin moves everything the poor own into 3 trades. There are 2 details I find genuinely brilliant. In the foreground, a skeletal ballad singer is dying, and out of his basket slips a printed ballad, The Downfall of Mrs. Gin, an anti-gin ballad that had been printed in the Gentleman's Magazine in June 1736, in the run-up to the act. So the propaganda is literally falling from a dying man's hands. Hogarth was capable of putting his own side's pamphlet in the picture and letting it drop. And in the middle distance a house is collapsing, and in its exposed attic a barber has hanged himself, because when nobody can afford a shave, the barber starves. That is a whole economy of failure in one small figure at the back of a print. Now turn to Beer Street, which is the half people forget. Everyone in Beer Street is fat, cheerful and working. A blacksmith, a drayman, paviers mending the road, fish sellers, builders on a roof, a tailor at a window. Beer is being drunk in enormous quantities, and the result is prosperity, industry and good humour. The verses beneath, written not by Hogarth, but by the Reverend James Townley, call beer the happy produce of our isle, and end by leaving water pointedly to France. That is the same argument Parliament made in 1690, still running 60 years later. English drink, English grain, English strength, and let the French have the water. And the only failing business in Beer Street is the pawnbroker, Pinch, whose building is crumbling, and who has to take his beer in through a hatch in the door, because he dare not open it. He is the exact mirror of Gripe, who prospers in Gin Lane. There is one thin, wretched figure in the whole of Beer Street. He is a sign painter up on a scaffold, and what he is painting is an advertisement for gin. He is the hinge between the two pictures. I would ask you to hold one thing about these prints, and it is what the London Museum itself says about Gin Lane, that it is a wild nightmare, not a picture of reality. Even Dickens, writing in 1836, looked at it and said that what it really showed was that poverty, rather than gin, was the cause of the misery. It is the most famous image of 18th century London ever made, and it was drawn to sell a bill. And the bill was coming because by 1751 the argument had gone national. A Commons Committee on Felonies had attributed the rise in robbery and murder to spirits, and petitions were arriving not only from London, but from Bristol, from Manchester, from Norwich. Whatever this was, the country had decided it was everybody's problem. The act that finally worked. Before the famous Act of 1751, there is one more failure to record, and it is the strangest of them all because it goes backwards. In 1747, Parliament raised the duty on distillers and then permitted wholesale distillers to buy a £50 licence entitling them to sell direct to the public. That is to say, the state took money from the large distillers in exchange for allowing them to do exactly the thing that, 4 years later, it would decide was the central evil to be stamped out. 11 years after trying to abolish retail gin, Parliament was selling the right to retail it to the biggest producers in the country for cash. That is what 22 years of policy looks like from the inside. Not a march towards a solution, but a series of lurches, each one responding to the wreckage of the last, and several of them going the wrong way for the excellent reason that the Treasury was short. And then came the Sale of Spirits Act, which received the royal assent on the 25th of June 1751, and came into force on the 1st of July. It is often called the Tippling Act, and it remained on the statute book in one form or another until 1965. Its stated purpose is in its own preamble, and I want you to hear the exact words, because they tell you what Parliament thought the problem was. The Act was to curtail the immoderate drinking of distilled spirituous liquor by persons of the meanest and lowest sort. Persons of the meanest and lowest sort. 30 years after the Middlesex justices wrote about the inferior sort of people, the same sentiment is now in a statute. The problem, as Parliament defined it in law, was never drinking. It was drinking by particular people. Now here is where almost every popular account of the gin craze goes wrong, and where the real interest lies. Everyone assumes that the act that finally worked must have been the harshest one, the culmination, the crackdown, the moment the state finally hit hard enough. It was the opposite. The 1751 Act was, in the terms that had mattered before, remarkably gentle. Licence to retail spirits was set at £2 a year. £2, not 50, not 20, 2. 15 years earlier, the state had demanded 14 months' wages for the same permission and had issued 20 licenses in total. Now it was asking for something a modest shopkeeper could actually pay, and this was the act that worked. Because it had stopped trying to price gin out of existence and started doing something entirely different. Read the 3 core provisions and you can see the change of mind. First, distillers were forbidden to retail directly. The 1747 arrangement was reversed. The chain was broken at the top rather than the bottom. Second, and this is the heart of it, retailing was restricted to premises of a certain minimum annual value. The figure usually given is £10 a year, and I will hedge that number because it rests on thinner ground than the rest. But the principle is unmistakable, whatever the exact threshold. To sell spirits, you now had to occupy real, rated, assessed premises of some substance. Think about who that excludes, not the person who cannot afford the fee. The fee is now trivial. It excludes the person with no premises, the woman with a basket, the wheelbarrow, the stall, the boat, the back room of a lodging, the cellar with a cat's head on the wall. All of them are now outside the law, not because they cannot pay, but because they are not the kind of person the Act has decided may sell. Third, debts under 20 shillings for spirits were made irrecoverable at law. You could no longer sue to collect a gin slate. That single clause quietly killed the running account trick that had defeated the 2-gallon rule, and killed the practice of extending credit to poor drinkers at the same time, since a debt you cannot enforce is a debt you will not extend. So the state stopped asking how much and started asking who. It abandoned the price weapon entirely and reclassified who was allowed to sell: rate-paying, propertied townspeople with a fixed address, a landlord, and a name on an assessment. Why did it work when everything before it had not? 3 reasons, and they are all worth having. The first is that it was negotiated rather than imposed. The 1751 Act was drafted in consultation with the main interest groups in gin production. The distillers were in the room, and so for the first time the bill met little serious opposition in the Commons, and far more importantly, the landed interest did not set out to strangle it as it had strangled the Act of 1729. Every earlier act had been a war on a trade. This one was a deal with it. The second is arithmetic. The enforcement problem shrank from something impossible to something merely difficult. Before, the state had to find several thousand invisible sellers in back rooms across Middlesex, and had at its disposal a few dozen excise officers and some reluctant parish constables. Now it had to keep an eye on a few hundred visible, rate-paying, licensed premises with painted boards and street doors and much to lose. That is not the same task. That is a task a pre-modern state can actually do. And the third is that there was no informer economy. Nobody rebuilt the bounty machine. There was no £5 half share, no incentive for your neighbour to come into your shop with a penny and a plan, no reason for a crowd to gather outside a magistrate's window. The 1751 Act asked nothing of ordinary Londoners except that they buy their gin at a licensed door, and ordinary Londoners on the whole did. So picture what a street looks like afterwards, because the visual change is real. Where there had been a chandler with a bottle under the counter, a woman with a basket at the corner, a stall by the church, and a wall with a carved cat on it, there is now a door, a proper door with a painted board over it, and a man behind the counter whose name is on a license and whose rent is on a list. Trade did not vanish, it moved indoors, into premises, into daylight, into the records. And that last point, into the records, is going to matter enormously in a few minutes, when we come to look at the numbers, because a trade that has moved into licensed premises is a trade that can, for the first time, be counted. There is one thing this act was not, though, and it is the thing it is usually given credit for. It was not the end of the gin craze. Consumption had peaked 8 years before it was past, and the fall that came afterwards has another cause entirely, one that no member of Parliament voted for and none of them could have arranged. We will come to it, but before we do, we have to deal honestly with the thing everyone believes about these years, and it will be gentler than you expect. What the numbers really showed. This chapter is about being wrong, and about how easy it was, and I want to be careful with it, because it would be very simple to spend 15 minutes explaining how much cleverer we are than the people in this story. We are not. They were working with what they had. It is worth understanding exactly what they had. Here is the belief. It is 300 years old, and it is still the first thing anybody says about the gin craze, that gin was killing London, that the city buried more people than it baptized, that its population only grew because the countryside kept sending more, and that the reason was in the bottle. The evidence for it was the bills of mortality, the weekly and annual returns of burials and christenings that London had been keeping since the 16th century, the closest thing the age had to vital statistics. And the bills did show a terrible thing. Through the middle of the 18th century, burials in London consistently exceeded baptisms. Corbin Morris tabulated it in 1751. The pamphleteers pointed at it. Everyone could see the gap. Modern demographers have gone back to those numbers with the tools we now have, and 4 separate problems have emerged. None of them makes the suffering less real. All of them make the causal claim untenable. The first is the most decisive. Infant and child mortality in London did rise dreadfully. It more than doubled between the 16th century and the mid-18th. Around 2/3 of children born in London died before the age of 5. But when the best demographic work we have breaks that down by family wealth, the horror is nearly flat across the social scale. It rose in wealthy families and in poor families alike. Roughly 2/3 of children died before 5 regardless of social position. Sit with that, because it is the whole argument in one line. The families who were not drinking penny gin, the families with servants and doctors and clean clothes, and no reason ever to go near a chandler's counter for a quartern, were burying their children at nearly the same rate as the families who were. Whatever was killing London's children, it was not a drink that only some of them could afford. The second problem sharpens it further, and comes from more recent work still. Researchers examining infant feeding practices in this period found a social gradient running the opposite way. Infants of wealthy families at substantially higher risk than even pauper infants, largely because wealthy mothers were less likely to breastfeed and their children were more often put out to nurse or fed artificially. If that finding holds, the picture is not merely that gin fails to explain the deaths. It is that the deaths track feeding and sanitation so strongly that they run backwards against wealth altogether. I should be honest and say that these two findings argue with each other, and that the argument is live. Sample sizes are small, the sources are difficult. This is a field still working. But every serious line of inquiry in it points away from gin. The third problem is with the bills themselves. They do not record deaths. They record registered burials of people baptized as Anglicans, which is a different thing in a city full of dissenters, Catholics, Jews, foreigners, and the unbaptized poor. Historians who have examined them closely find them tolerably accurate in aggregate, but very misleading for particular parishes, with many infant and child burials simply missed, probably in part because bodies were carried out of the city to be buried elsewhere and never entered the London books at all. So the single most quoted statistic of the entire panic, that London buried more than it christened, is measuring parish paperwork at least as much as it is measuring death. And the fourth is the cleanest of all, because it is an experiment that history ran for us. Between the peak in 1743 and the year 1757, per capita spirit consumption in England fell by roughly 73%, from 2.2 gallons a head to about 0.6 of a gallon. That is a collapse. If gin had been driving the death rate should have fallen with it, sharply, within a few years. It did not. London's infant and child mortality did eventually halve, but on a much longer time scale over the following century, and for other reasons entirely. Better housing, cleaner water, changes in feeding, the slow accumulation of 100 small things. The experiment was run. The result came back negative. Now, how did the belief become so fixed? The propaganda of the 1730s is one part of the answer, but the more interesting part is that a serious historian picked it up. Dorothy George's London Life in the 18th Century, published in 1925, is a genuinely great book, and it took the 1730s material largely at face value. Her framing became the standard account, and it is still, a century later, the version that reaches most people. The panic wrote the history, and the history was believed for 200 years. And now the part I actually want to leave you with, because everything above is only clearing the ground for it. The physicians were not lying. Think about what a doctor in 1726 was in a position to know. The Royal College of Physicians petitioned Parliament that winter, describing people made diseased, not fit for business, poor, a burthen to themselves and neighbours, and blaming spirits for weak, feeble and distempered children. Those men were not inventing anything. They were describing what they saw in front of them in the streets and the sick rooms of London, people in front of their eyes being destroyed by something new. What they did not have was a mechanism. There was no pathology. Nobody had opened a body and connected what they found there to how a person had lived. Alcoholic cirrhosis, the specific, visible physical damage that heavy drinking does to a liver, was not described until 1793, when Matthew Bailey published The Morbid Anatomy of Some of the Most Important Parts of the Human Body, the first systematic pathology treatise in English. 1793, 42 years after Gin Lane, 2 generations after the act. And even Bailey, looking at the thing itself on the table in front of him, hedged. He noted that the disease was most frequent in hard drinkers, but said he could see no necessary connection between that mode of life and that condition of the liver. He had the evidence in his hands, and he still would not overstate what it proved. That is what medicine looks like before it has a mechanism. 42 years after the Great Panic, the most careful anatomist in England finally sees the damage, writes it down, and declines to say for certain why it is there. So of course the physicians of 1726 reached for the explanation they had. They could see ruin and they could see gin, and they had no instrument in the world that could tell them how the one made the other, or whether it did. They put their names to a petition in good faith, and were wrong about the scale and right about a great deal else. That is not fraud. That is medicine before pathology. and there is no version of us that would have done better in their shoes. The honest formulation, then, for everything we have spent this evening on is this: the drinking was real, the destitution was real, the disorder was real, and the arithmetic of a penny a dram was real, and the 6,000 doors were real, and Judith Defoe is in the record and always will be. And the specific claim that gin was killing London on a mass demographic scale was manufactured, partly in good faith, partly not, out of numbers that nobody at the time had any means of checking. The rain has stopped somewhere in the last hour. Listen, and you will find that the sound under the window has changed, only water running off the tiles now, one drip at a time, slower and slower. What actually ended it? So if the law did not end it, what did? Harvest. I want to bring this home gently because it is the calmest ending this story could possibly have, and it is also true. The verdict of the historians who have studied the consumption figures most carefully is that gin drinking fell not because of legislation, but because of the rising cost of grain. And the peer-reviewed analysis of the whole sequence, running a time series across the entire period, is blunter still. Each of the three major gin acts succeeded only in the short term, and in each case consumption actually increased shortly afterwards. Of the celebrated Act of 1751, that study concluded that it succeeded by accident rather than by design. By accident, 22 years of legislation, and the final verdict on the one that is credited with victory is that it happened to be standing in the right place when something else arrived. Here is what arrived. Grain got dear, not in one dramatic year at first, but over the 1750s, as the long run of abundant harvests that had begun the century came to an end. And rising grain prices did three things at once, each of which cut in the same direction. Name all three, because together they are the whole ending. First, distilling became less profitable. Spirit made from expensive grain is expensive spirit, and the margin that had made every backroom compounder in London a going concern thinned and closed. Second, and this is the one nobody expects, the political coalition that had protected the trade since 1690 simply dissolved. Remember why the landowners had defended gin. It gave them a market for the worst grain of the harvest. But when grain is scarce and dear, there is no worst grain. Every bushel has a buyer at a good price for bread. Landed interest no longer needed distilling, and so it no longer defended it, and the strongest wall the reformers had spent 30 years failing to break down was not broken down. It was dismantled by its owners quietly because it had stopped being useful. And third, at the other end of the chain, higher food prices with wages that did not follow meant the poor simply could not afford it. Penny a dram had been possible in a world of cheap bread. In a world of dear bread, the penny had somewhere else to go. Then in 1757 the harvest failed outright. The government's response was immediate and drastic, and had nothing to do with morality. Exports of corn and malt were banned, and so was all distillation from wheat, barley, malt, or any other grain. Not a licensing measure, not a duty, a flat prohibition on turning food into spirit while the country was short of food. When the harvest of 1758 came in barely better, the ban was extended. For 3 years English grain distilling stopped, and when it was restored in March of 1760, it came back at double the previous excise duty. That is the hinge on which everything finally turns. 3 years of interruption, during which the habits and the supply chains and the backroom stills all went cold, and then, a permanent doubling of the tax. When legal grain gin returned, it returned expensive, and it stayed expensive relative to beer. And beer, meanwhile, had become cheap and excellent. The brewing industry grew enormously through these decades, and the price of beer fell, and the historians of the trade are in no doubt that this contributed as much as anything to gin's decline. And there is one beer in particular that did it. Porter, attested from 1721, and it was the first beer in England that could be made on a genuinely large scale and dispatched ready to drink. No long conditioning in the publican's cellar, no guesswork, the same product every time, brewed in enormous quantity by a handful of great London breweries. Its inventor is disputed, and the stories about him are probably legend. Its effect is not disputed at all. By the middle of the 18th century, porter outsold every other beer in London combined. So watch what happens to a person standing in a street in 1760 with a few pence in their hand. Gin is dearer than it has ever been in living memory. 3 years off the market and back at double duty. Bread is dear. And there, at the end of the road, is a house selling a dark, strong, filling, extremely cheap beer that comes off a dray in barrels from a brewery the size of a small town. And it costs less than it has ever cost. And you can sit down in a room with a fire and drink it slowly among people you know. The city changed its drink. That is all that happened. Nobody reformed. Nobody was persuaded. There was no moment of moral awakening in Shoreditch. And I would rather say that plainly than pretend otherwise. The poor did not become virtuous. They switched to the cheaper intoxicant, which is precisely, exactly, and for identical reasons why they had switched to gin in the first place 60 years earlier, when Parliament made grain spirit cost a penny a gallon and put 4 and 9 on a gallon of beer. The city followed the price down in 1690, and it followed the price back up in 1760. It was never anything else. Look at the numbers one last time, and then we will let them go. 1/3 of a gallon a head in 1700, 2/3 by 1720, 1 3/10 in 1729. 2.2 gallons at the peak in 1743, 1.2 by 1752, 6/10 in 1757, back near enough to where the century began, and then flat for 20 years through the 1770s. It never came back. There is one honest loose end, and I will name it in a sentence rather than pretend it is tidy. The excise figures show a sharp fall between 1751 and 1752, which looks like the act working, but several lines of evidence suggest drinking stayed high until the grain ban of 1757. The likeliest reconciliation is that the 1751 Act moved the trade into licensed premises where it could at last be counted. So what fell suddenly was the number of taxed gallons, not the number of gallons drunk, which is a rather good final joke, in a story about numbers nobody could check. And what became of the trade? It shrank and hardened. From something over 1,500 small distillers in the 1730s, England had about 40 licensed firms by 1794. The craze did not end by abolishing gin. It ended by turning gin from a seller's business into a corporation's, which leaves us at the end of a very long night with something like this. A parliament in 1690, wanting to help its farmers and hurt the French, wrote a tax schedule. Nobody in that chamber was thinking about a street in St. Giles 60 years later. The schedule did exactly what it was designed to do, and then went on doing other things nobody had designed for 3 decades, until a city was full of it. Then a great many serious, well-intentioned, frightened people spent 22 years and 8 Acts of Parliament trying to legislate the consequence away without touching the cause, because the cause was their own agricultural policy and the cause had votes. And when the end came, it came from outside the argument entirely, from the weather over some fields in 1757, and the price of barley, and a new kind of beer. The lamps are still burning outside your shutter. They will burn until the man comes round to put them out, some time after the sky goes grey. Down at the end of the street, the watch has just gone by for the last time tonight, and you can hear him a long way off now, saying the hour to nobody, the way he has all night and will again tomorrow. The city is asleep. It has been getting quietly better all this time, the ditch covered over, the market built above it, 4,000 lamps burning where there were none, and it will go on getting better and worse in the same breath, the way cities do, long after everyone in this story is gone. There is nothing more to know tonight. The rain has stopped. The fire is down to a red ring. Let your hands go loose and your jaw, and let the sound of the street go on without you. Sleep well.